On the evening of May 3, 2007, in a quiet coastal town in southern Portugal, a 3-year-old British girl vanished without leaving a single confirmed trace behind. Her name was Madeleine McCann. What began as an ordinary family vacation soon transformed into one of the most haunting and controversial missing person cases of the modern era. More than a decade later, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann remains officially unresolved. No body has ever been found, no definitive crime scene has ever been identified, and no individual has ever been formally charged in connection with her disappearance. Yet, despite the absence of clear answers, this case has never faded from public consciousness. Instead, it has grown larger, more complex, and more divisive with time. This is not simply the story of a missing child. It is the story of an investigation marked by uncertainty, international pressure, media scrutiny, and deeply polarized opinions. It is a case that forced law enforcement agencies across multiple countries to confront their limitations. And it is a case that continues to raise uncomfortable questions about responsibility, judgment, and the thin line between fact and speculation. From the moment Madeleine McCann was reported missing, the world paid attention. News outlets across Europe and beyond interrupted regular programming. Front pages carried her photograph, candlelight vigils were held in multiple countries. Posters bearing her image appeared in airports, shopping centers, and city streets thousands of miles from where she was last seen. Very quickly, this was no longer a local investigation, it had become a global phenomenon. But global attention does not guarantee clarity. In many ways, it complicates it. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into years, the case evolved into something far more complex than a simple search for a missing child. Competing theories emerged. Official statements were questioned, investigative decisions were criticized in real time, often by individuals far removed from the actual evidence. Public opinion hardened, fractured, and, in some cases, turned hostile. At the center of it all stood two grieving parents, thrust into a relentless spotlight while facing the unthinkable loss of their daughter. Every word they spoke, every gesture they made, and every decision they had taken before and after that night was scrutinized, dissected, and debated. For some, they were victims of a terrible crime. For others, they became subjects of suspicion, and for many, the truth seemed impossibly out of reach. This opening chapter does not seek to answer the question of what happened to Madeleine McCann. Instead, it seeks to establish the gravity of the case, the atmosphere surrounding it, and the reasons why, even after so many years, it continues to command attention and provoke debate. Because this case matters not only due to the fate of one child, but because it exposes the vulnerabilities of investigative systems under pressure. It reveals how quickly narratives can be shaped by media influence. And it demonstrates how public perception can, at times, move faster than verified evidence. The disappearance occurred in Praia da Luz, a small resort town in the Algarve region of Portugal. At the time, it was known primarily as a peaceful holiday destination, popular with families seeking quiet beaches and mild weather. Crime rates were low. Violent offenses were rare. There was nothing about the setting that suggested it would soon become synonymous with one of the most infamous missing person cases in history. Yet, within hours of Madeleine's disappearance, Praia da Luz became a focal point for law enforcement, journalists, and later, private investigators. Roads were closed, search teams were deployed. Witnesses were questioned, but from the very beginning, one troubling reality became apparent. There were no clear signs of forced entry, no confirmed eyewitness accounts of an abduction, and no physical evidence that clearly indicated what had taken place inside the apartment where Madeleine was last seen. This absence of clarity would define the case moving forward. In the early stages of any missing child investigation, time is critical. The first hours often determine the trajectory of the case. Decisions made under pressure can either preserve vital evidence or allow it to disappear forever. In the case of Madeleine McCann, those initial hours would later become the subject of intense debate, as investigators, analysts, and commentators questioned whether critical opportunities were missed. But before examining the investigation itself, it is essential to understand the context in which this disappearance occurred. Who was Madeleine McCann? Who were her parents? Why was the family in Portugal, And what exactly happened on the night she vanished? These questions form the foundation of the case. Without understanding them, it is impossible to evaluate the theories, the suspects, or the investigative decisions that followed. This series will examine the disappearance of Madeleine McCann with a disciplined, evidence-based approach. Facts will be clearly distinguished from speculation. Official statements will be placed in context. And where uncertainty exists, it will be acknowledged openly rather than filled with assumption. Because in cases like this, certainty is rare. And the search for truth requires patience, restraint, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable ambiguity. More than 17 years after Madeleine McCann disappeared, the same fundamental question remains unanswered. What truly happened on the night of May 3, 2007? To begin answering that question, we must first step back and examine the lives and circumstances that brought the McCann family to Praia da Luz, and set the stage for a mystery that continues to haunt investigators and the public alike. Before the events that would bring their family into the center of global attention, the McCanns lived what many would describe as a structured and ordinary professional life in the United Kingdom. Kate McCann was a general practitioner, trained in anesthesiology, accustomed to long hospital shifts and high-responsibility environments. Gary McCann was a cardiologist, deeply involved in clinical research and hospital administration. Both were highly educated, disciplined, and familiar with systems that rely on protocols, schedules, and professional trust. They lived in Rothley, a village in Leicestershire, England, an area known for its quiet streets and strong sense of community. Their daily routine revolved around demanding medical careers, childcare responsibilities, and the rhythms common to families with young children. Madeleine, born in 2003, was their first child. By all accounts from friends, relatives, and caregivers, she was described as energetic, expressive, and socially confident for her age. She was often noted for her bright eyes and strong personality, characteristics that would later make her image instantly recognizable around the world. In 2004, the McCanns welcomed twins, Sean and Emily. The arrival of two additional children significantly altered the dynamics of family life. Balancing full-time medical careers with the care of three very young children required planning, routine, and reliance on structured childcare arrangements. Like many working parents, the McCanns depended on daycare services and shared parenting responsibilities, and they placed value on maintaining stability and predictability in their children's lives. By 2007, the family was under considerable professional pressure. Both parents were managing demanding roles within the British healthcare system, which at the time faced staffing shortages and increasing workloads. According to later accounts, the planned holiday to Portugal was seen as an opportunity to rest, reconnect, and spend uninterrupted time together as a family. The destination was chosen not for adventure or novelty, but for its reputation as a safe, family-oriented resort. The McCanns did not travel alone. They were part of a larger group of friends, many of whom were also medical professionals with young children. This group dynamic is important to understand because it influenced daily routines during the trip. Meals were often shared. Childcare responsibilities were informally coordinated. The atmosphere was described as relaxed and familiar, built on years of friendship and mutual trust. From the perspective of the adults involved, the holiday was structured around predictability. The resort offered children's clubs, evening dining options, and accommodations designed for families. During the daytime, parents participated in recreational activities while children attended supervised programs. Evenings followed a similar pattern. Children were put to bed early, and adults gathered for dinner nearby. This routine, repeated over several nights, created a sense of normalcy and security. There was no indication, at least outwardly, that the family perceived any immediate risk. The resort was not isolated, but it was calm. There was no history of violent crime associated with the area that would have raised concern among visitors. For families accustomed to structured professional environments, the setting appeared controlled and safe. Understanding this background is essential because it frames the decisions that would later be examined in extreme detail. Many of the choices made by the McCanns during the trip were not spontaneous or reckless in their own perception, but rather consistent with routines they had already established during the holiday. These routines would later be judged through the lens of hindsight, but at the time, they were viewed as reasonable within the context of the environment and the group's shared practices. It is also important to recognize that the McCanns were not public figures prior to this event. They had no experience managing media attention, public suspicion, or legal scrutiny outside of professional medical oversight. When Madeleine disappeared, they were abruptly transitioned from private individuals into the subjects of one of the most intense media investigations in modern history. Their professional backgrounds would later shape public perception in conflicting ways. Some viewed their medical training as evidence of rationality and composure under stress. Others interpreted the same traits as emotional detachment. These interpretations, often contradictory, would fuel speculation and commentary far removed from the factual record. At the time they arrived in Portugal, however, none of this existed. There was no narrative, no controversy, and no suspicion. There was only a family, their friends, and a shared expectation of an uneventful holiday. The McCanns could not have anticipated that their personal lives would soon be dissected on an international stage, nor that ordinary decisions made in the context of a vacation would later be scrutinized as potential points of failure. To understand what happened next, it is necessary to move from the family's background to the physical environment in which the disappearance occurred. The layout of the resort, the apartment, and the surrounding area would all play critical roles in shaping the investigation that followed. Praia da Luz, at the time of the McCann family's visit in the spring of 2007, was a small seaside town with a population that fluctuated significantly depending on the tourist season. Located in the western Algarve region of Portugal, it was characterized by low-rise buildings, narrow streets, and a pace of life markedly slower than that of larger resort destinations. The area catered primarily to families and older travelers seeking calm surroundings rather than nightlife or large-scale entertainment. The McCanns and their friends were staying at the Ocean Club Resort, a complex consisting of multiple apartment blocks, swimming pools, restaurants, and recreational facilities. The apartments were privately owned but managed and rented through the resort, creating a hybrid environment that blended residential and hotel-style accommodation. This structure meant that some apartments were occupied by tourists, while others were used by long-term residents or owners. The McCann family's apartment was located on the ground floor of one of these blocks, identified as Apartment 5A. The unit faced a public area that included pedestrian walkways and access routes used by both guests and non-guests. While the apartment was not directly adjacent to a main road, it was not enclosed within a gated or restricted access compound. This detail would later become one of the most closely examined aspects of the case. Inside, the apartment followed a standard layout, a living area connected to a kitchen, a bathroom, and two bedrooms. One bedroom was used by the adults, while the second was occupied by the children. Madeleine slept in a bed next to her younger siblings, the twins, who were placed in cots. The bedroom window faced outward toward the front of the building, while a sliding patio door opened onto the exterior area. During the holiday, the group's daily routine followed a consistent pattern. Mornings and afternoons were spent at the resort's facilities or nearby beaches. Children attended organized activities, while adults participated in sports or socialized. Evenings typically involved shared dinners at the resort's tapas restaurant, located a short walking distance from the apartments. The distance between the tapas restaurant and Apartment 5A has been described as approximately 50 to 60 meters. While this distance is relatively short, it is not insignificant, especially considering that the route involved passing along public walkways and crossing areas not visible from the restaurant's seating area. The restaurant itself was busy in the evenings, filled with other guests and families. On multiple nights prior to May 3rd, the adults followed a routine in which they put their children to bed and then went to dinner, returning periodically to check on them. These checks were informal and staggered, with different adults returning to their respective apartments at intervals. According to later statements, these checks involved listening at the door and visually confirming that the children were asleep. This routine created a sense of reassurance among the group. Nothing out of the ordinary had occurred on previous nights. No disturbances were reported. No suspicious individuals were observed near the apartments. The environment appeared stable, reinforcing the perception that the arrangement was safe. However, from an investigative standpoint, the physical characteristics of the apartment and its surroundings introduced variables that would later complicate the case. The ground floor location meant that access to the apartment did not require passing through controlled entry points. The presence of both a window and a patio door created multiple potential points of entry and exit. Additionally, the area surrounding the apartment was accessible to pedestrians who were not associated with the resort. Lighting conditions in the vicinity varied. While some areas were illuminated, others were dimly lit at night. Sight lines between the restaurant and the apartment were interrupted by walls, landscaping, and building corners. These environmental factors would later be reconstructed and analyzed in detail by investigators attempting to determine whether an abduction could have occurred unnoticed. Another important element was the level of noise typical in the area during the evening hours. Background sounds from nearby apartments, passing pedestrians, and resort activity could mask unusual noises. This raised questions about whether a disturbance inside the apartment would have been audible to someone outside, or whether sounds from outside would have drawn attention. The resort staff, at that time, had no record of unusual incidents involving the McCann apartment prior to the night Madeleine disappeared. Maintenance logs did not indicate forced repairs. Housekeeping staff did not report irregularities. These absences of evidence, while not conclusive, would later influence how investigators assessed the likelihood of certain scenarios. Praia da Luz itself had limited law enforcement presence. The local police station served a small population and was not accustomed to handling high-profile international cases. When Madeleine was reported missing, resources were quickly overwhelmed, and assistance from regional and national authorities became necessary. The setting, therefore, was one of apparent tranquility layered with underlying vulnerabilities. A family-oriented resort, open access, multiple points of entry, and a reliance on routine rather than formal security measures. These factors would become central to every theory proposed in the years that followed. With this physical and environmental context established, the focus now shifts to the specific sequence of events on the evening of May 3, 2007, a timeline that would be scrutinized minute by minute, and one that forms the backbone of the entire investigation. The day of May 3, 2007 began without any indication that it would end differently from the previous days of the holiday. The McCann family followed their established routine. In the morning, the children were taken to the resort's kids' club, where staff later reported nothing unusual about Madeleine's behavior or mood. She was described as cheerful and engaged, interacting normally with other children and caregivers. This detail would later become significant, as it suggested no immediate distress or awareness of danger earlier that day. In the afternoon, the family reunited and spent time together at the resort. Witnesses recalled seeing the McCanns and their children near the swimming pool. Photographs taken earlier in the trip show Madeleine smiling, wearing a swimsuit, standing beside her father. These images would later become some of the most widely circulated visuals associated with the case, reinforcing the sense that everything appeared normal just hours before her disappearance. As evening approached, preparations followed the familiar pattern. The McCanns returned to apartment 5A, bathed the children, and put them to bed at approximately 7 p.m. Madeleine slept in the same room as her younger siblings. According to later statements, there was nothing unusual during this process. The children were calm, and Madeleine appeared tired but content. At around 8:30 p.m., Kate and Gary McCann left the apartment to join their friends for dinner at the Tapas restaurant. Before leaving, they reportedly checked on the children, ensuring they were asleep. The patio door was closed but not locked, while the bedroom window was closed. These details would later become central to discussions about access to the apartment. The group gathered at the restaurant shortly before 9 p.m. The atmosphere was relaxed. Conversations focused on ordinary topics, and there was no indication of urgency or concern. The adults had a clear view of the restaurant area, but no direct line of sight to the McCann apartment. At approximately 9:05 p.m., one of the adults in the group volunteered to perform the first check on the children. This individual walked back to the apartment complex, entered apartment 5A, and observed that the children were asleep. Madeleine was seen lying in her bed. The twins were also asleep. No signs of disturbance were reported. This check would later become one of the last confirmed sightings of Madeleine. Between 9:05 p.m. and 10 p.m., the group continued dining. Additional checks were conducted by other adults on their own children. In nearby apartments, these checks were not synchronized, and no formal schedule was followed. The assumption was that each family would monitor their own apartment periodically. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Gary McCann left the table to check on his children. He returned shortly afterward and reported that everything appeared normal. According to his account, he entered the apartment through the unlocked patio door, checked the children's bedroom, and observed Madeleine and the twins asleep. He did not notice anything unusual about the window or the door at that time. Shortly after 10 p.m., Kate McCann left the restaurant to perform another check. When she arrived at apartment 5A, she entered through the patio door and walked toward the children's bedroom. It was at this moment that the routine was broken. Upon opening the bedroom door, Kate noticed that Madeleine's bed was empty. Initially, she believed Madeleine might have climbed into her parents' bed, something that had happened on previous occasions. However, upon checking the adult bedroom and finding it empty, her concern escalated rapidly. Kate then observed that the bedroom window was open, along with the exterior shutter. This detail stood out immediately, as it differed from earlier checks. According to her later statements, she felt a sudden sense of panic. She ran out of the apartment and toward the tapas restaurant, shouting that Madeleine had been taken. What followed was a moment of confusion and urgency. Members of the group quickly dispersed to search the immediate area. They checked nearby apartments, bushes, pathways, and access routes. Resort staff were alerted. Guests were questioned informally. The initial search was chaotic, driven by desperation rather than coordination. Local authorities were contacted shortly afterward. The official time at which police were notified has been a subject of later debate, but it is generally accepted that the alarm was raised within a relatively short period after the discovery of Madeleine's absence. However, by that point, critical time had already passed. The early moments following the discovery were marked by uncertainty. There was no clear understanding of what had occurred. No one had heard screams. No one had seen a stranger carrying a child. There were no obvious signs of struggle inside the apartment. This lack of immediate evidence complicated the response from the outset. As the night progressed, the search expanded beyond the immediate vicinity of the apartment. Police officers arrived, took preliminary statements, and began organizing a broader effort. Dogs were not deployed immediately. Roadblocks were limited. These early decisions would later be examined closely, as investigators attempted to determine whether opportunities to preserve evidence or identify suspects had been missed. By the early hours of May 4th, the reality had begun to settle in. Madeleine McCann was missing, and there was no clear indication of where she was or how she had disappeared. What had begun as a routine child check had escalated into an international emergency. The timeline of that evening, reconstructed minute by minute, would become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the entire case. Small discrepancies in time estimates, movements, and recollections would later be magnified under intense investigative and public pressure. Memory, influenced by shock and stress, would prove unreliable in some respects, further complicating efforts to establish a definitive sequence of events. This sequence of ordinary actions followed by sudden crisis lies at the heart of the Madeleine McCann case. It is the point at which normality ends and uncertainty begins, and it is from this moment forward that the investigation, with all its complexities and controversies, truly begins. In the immediate aftermath of Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the response shifted rapidly from informal searching to an official investigation, though not without confusion and limitations. Local police officers from the Guarda Nacional Republicana arrived first, followed later by officers from the Polícia Judiciária, Portugal's primary criminal investigation unit. The scene they encountered was already compromised by the urgency of the situation. Friends, resort staff, and guests had moved through the apartment and surrounding areas in an attempt to locate the missing child. While understandable, these early actions complicated efforts to preserve a pristine crime scene. Initial police procedures focused on gathering basic information. Statements were taken from the parents, their friends, and resort employees. Officers documented the layout of apartment 5A and the condition in which it was found. The open bedroom window and shutter immediately became a focal point, as did the unlocked patio door. However, there was uncertainty about when exactly these elements had been opened or closed, and by whom. Without definitive answers, investigators were left with competing possibilities rather than clear conclusions. The first hours are often critical in missing child cases, particularly when abduction is suspected. In this instance, there were delays in deploying certain resources. Search dogs trained to detect human scent were not introduced until days later. Roadblocks were limited during the initial night, and border alerts were not issued immediately. At the time, local authorities did not definitively classify the case as an abduction, which influenced the scope and urgency of their response. As dawn broke on May 4th, the investigation expanded. Volunteers from the local community joined police in searching nearby fields, beaches, wells, and abandoned structures. Helicopters were later deployed, scanning the surrounding terrain. Despite the growing scale of the effort, no physical trace of Madeleine was discovered. There were no items of clothing, no footprints conclusively linked to her, and no confirmed sightings after the initial alarm. Media presence increased dramatically within hours. Journalists arrived from across Portugal, the United Kingdom, and other European countries. Cameras surrounded the resort. Reporters sought interviews, statements, and images. This intense attention placed additional pressure on investigators, who were now conducting their work under constant public scrutiny. Every decision, delay, or perceived inconsistency became subject to immediate commentary. The lack of physical evidence began to shape the investigation's early direction. Without a clear crime scene, investigators relied heavily on witness statements and timelines. Minor discrepancies between accounts, common in stressful situations, took on outsized importance. Questions emerged about the exact timing of checks, the sequence of movements, and the visibility of the apartment from surrounding areas. Rather than narrowing possibilities, the growing body of testimony often introduced new uncertainties. As days passed without a breakthrough, the focus of the investigation subtly shifted. Attention moved inward, toward the actions and decisions of the adults involved. This transition did not occur as a formal accusation, but as a consequence of investigative necessity. In the absence of external suspects or evidence of forced entry, investigators examined the possibility that the disappearance might not fit the traditional abduction narrative. This shift marked a turning point. The McCanns, initially treated solely as parents of a missing child, found themselves subjected to increasingly detailed questioning. Their routines, statements, and emotional responses were analyzed. Public opinion, influenced by selective media coverage and cultural misunderstandings, began to divide sharply. Sympathy and suspicion coexisted uneasily. Despite extensive searches and growing international involvement, the investigation struggled to establish a clear direction. Leads were followed and abandoned. Sightings were reported and dismissed. Each new theory generated attention but failed to produce tangible results. The absence of definitive evidence continued to define the case, reinforcing a cycle of speculation and frustration. By the end of the first week, it was evident that this was no longer a short-term missing child investigation. It had evolved into a complex, open-ended inquiry with no clear resolution in sight. The early investigative phase, marked by urgency and uncertainty, would leave lasting questions about what was done, what could have been done differently, and how those initial decisions influenced everything that followed. As the case progressed, scrutiny intensified, and the focus of the investigation would soon enter its most controversial phase, one that would dramatically alter public perception and permanently reshape the narrative surrounding Madeleine McCann's disappearance. As the investigation moved beyond its initial phase, the focus of the Portuguese authorities began to narrow in ways that would later prove deeply controversial. By the summer of 2007, the Polish judiciary was under significant pressure. International attention had not diminished, leads had failed to produce results, and the absence of physical evidence continued to hinder progress. In this environment, investigators increasingly concentrated on inconsistencies within witness statements rather than on identifying an external suspect. This shift was not unique to this case. In prolonged investigations where evidence is scarce, law enforcement often re-examines the closest circle around the victim. In the Madeleine McCann case, however, this approach unfolded under an extraordinary level of public and media scrutiny. Every development was reported in real time, often without context or confirmation, shaping public opinion long before conclusions were reached. By early September 2007, both Kate and Gary McCann were formally named arguidos, a Portuguese legal status roughly equivalent to being persons of interest. This designation does not imply guilt, but it allows investigators to question individuals under a different legal framework. For the McCanns, this moment marked a dramatic turning point. They were no longer viewed solely as parents seeking their missing child, but as individuals whose actions were now being examined as part of a potential criminal inquiry. The decision was reportedly influenced by several factors. Investigators cited perceived inconsistencies in timelines, interpretations of forensic evidence, and behavioral assessments. One of the most debated elements involved the use of cadaver detection dogs and blood detection dogs, which were brought to the resort months after Madeleine's disappearance. These dogs allegedly alerted to certain areas of the apartment and to items belonging to the McCann family, including a rental car obtained weeks after the disappearance. While dog alerts can be valuable investigative tools, they are not considered conclusive evidence on their own. Their reliability depends on context, corroboration, and subsequent forensic confirmation. In this case, laboratory analysis failed to establish definitive proof that the alerts were linked to Madeleine. Nevertheless, the interpretation of these findings became a focal point of investigative theory and media reporting. Simultaneously, investigators explored the hypothesis that Madeleine may have died inside the apartment and that her disappearance was the result of an accidental death followed by concealment. This theory, though never proven, gained traction in public discourse due to selective leaks and speculative reporting. It introduced a narrative that profoundly affected how the case was perceived, both in Portugal and internationally. The McCanns consistently denied any involvement in their daughter's disappearance. They cooperated with authorities, provided statements, and maintained their account of events. However, the adversarial tone of the investigation created an atmosphere of mistrust. Communication between the family and investigators deteriorated. Legal representatives became more prominent. The collaborative search for a missing child gave way to a defensive legal posture on all sides. Cultural and procedural differences also played a role. British and Portuguese investigative practices differed in structure, communication style, and public transparency. Misunderstandings emerged regarding questioning techniques, the handling of evidence, and expectations of behavior. These differences were often interpreted negatively rather than neutrally, further complicating the investigation. Public reaction was swift and polarized. In the United Kingdom, media outlets largely framed the McCanns as victims of an aggressive and misguided investigation. In Portugal, some commentary emphasized the authority of local law enforcement and questioned foreign criticism. The case became a source of national tension, with legal, cultural, and emotional dimensions intertwining. Ultimately, in July 2008, the Portuguese authorities formally shelved the investigation, citing insufficient evidence to identify a suspect or determine what had happened to Madeleine. The arguido status of the McCanns was lifted, and the case was archived. No charges were filed. No definitive conclusions were reached. For many observers, this outcome raised more questions than it answered. Had the investigation focused too narrowly on the parents? Were alternative leads adequately pursued? Did early decisions limit later possibilities? These questions would persist long after the official closure of the Portuguese inquiry. Though the case was technically closed, it was far from over. The controversy surrounding the investigation, combined with continued public interest, ensured that Madeleine McCann's disappearance would remain an open wound. New efforts, new theories, and renewed investigations would emerge in the years that followed, shifting attention beyond Portugal and reshaping the search for answers. By the time the Portuguese investigation was officially shelved, the Madeleine McCann case had already taken on a life far beyond the confines of law enforcement. It had become a global media phenomenon, shaped as much by headlines, commentary, and public emotion as by verified facts. The intensity of coverage was unprecedented for a missing child case, and its influence on the investigation itself cannot be overstated. From the earliest days, the media response was immediate and relentless. News outlets competed for exclusives, often prioritizing speed over accuracy. Speculation filled gaps where confirmed information was lacking. Anonymous sources were cited. Partial leaks from within the investigation were presented as authoritative findings. In this environment, nuance was often lost, and complex legal or forensic concepts were reduced to simplified, and sometimes misleading, narratives. The McCann's decision to engage actively with the media further complicated matters. With the assistance of public relations advisors, they appeared in interviews, press conferences, and public appeals. Their intent, according to their own statements, was to keep Madeleine's disappearance in the public and to increase the chances of someone coming forward with information. However, this visibility also made them constant subjects of analysis. Facial expressions, word choices, and emotional responses were dissected frame by frame. For some observers, the McCann's composure was interpreted as strength. For others, it was seen as emotional distance. These interpretations often said more about audience expectations than about the reality of trauma. Grief does not present uniformly, yet the pressure to perform sorrow in a way that aligned with public expectation became an unspoken burden placed upon the parents. The media also played a significant role in amplifying unproven theories. Sensational claims were given prominence, sometimes without adequate challenge or context. The idea that Madeleine had died accidentally and that her parents had concealed her body, despite a lack of conclusive evidence, gained widespread attention largely through repeated media exposure rather than investigative confirmation. Once introduced, such narratives proved difficult to dislodge. Legal battles soon followed. The McCanns pursued libel actions against media organizations that published what they argued were false and damaging allegations. These cases highlighted the tension between press freedom and responsible reporting. Some outlets issued retractions or settlements, while others defended their coverage as being in the public interest. These legal confrontations further entrenched divisions in public opinion. At the same time, public interest did not diminish. Online forums, independent blogs, and amateur investigations proliferated. Individuals with no access to evidence or investigative authority offered elaborate reconstructions of events. While some discussions were thoughtful and restrained, others crossed into conjecture and accusation. The boundary between informed analysis and speculation became increasingly blurred. The international nature of the case added additional layers of complexity. Cultural differences influenced how actions and behaviors were interpreted. Statements made in one country were translated, reinterpreted, and sometimes distorted as they circulated globally. What was intended as a procedural explanation in one legal system could be perceived as evasive or suspicious in another. For law enforcement, this media environment posed significant challenges. Investigators had to contend not only with the absence of evidence, but with constant public pressure to produce results. Every development was scrutinized. Every silence was interpreted. In some cases, investigative strategies were revealed prematurely, potentially compromising their effectiveness. Over time, the media narrative became self-perpetuating. The case remained relevant not necessarily because of new evidence, but because of its unresolved status. Each anniversary prompted renewed coverage. Each rumor sparked another cycle of reporting. Madeleine McCann became a symbol, representing broader fears about child safety, parental responsibility, and the limits of justice. Yet, beneath the noise, the core reality remained unchanged. A child was missing, no definitive answers had been found. And despite years of coverage, debate, and legal action, the fundamental facts of the case had not advanced. As public attention ebbed and flowed, the investigation itself would eventually resurface in a new form, driven not by media pressure alone, but by renewed official interest from outside Portugal. This next phase would shift the focus once again, introducing new agencies, new resources, and new questions into a case that refused to fade into history. As the years passed, The absence of resolution created space for a wide range of theories, each attempting to explain what might have happened to Madeleine McCann. Some of these theories were grounded in investigative reasoning and available evidence, while others were driven primarily by speculation. Together, they formed a complex and often conflicting landscape of explanations that reflected both the uncertainty of the case and the human need for answers. One of the earliest and most persistent theories was that Madeleine had been abducted by a stranger. Supporters of this hypothesis pointed to the open window and shutter, the unlocked patio door, and the lack of noise reported by witnesses. They argued that the location of the apartment, combined with limited surveillance and open access to the resort, could have allowed an opportunistic offender to enter unnoticed. This theory was further reinforced by reported sightings of an unidentified man carrying a child near the apartment complex on the night of the disappearance, though these accounts were never conclusively verified. Another theory proposed that the disappearance was the result of an accident within the apartment, followed by a concealment of the body. This hypothesis gained attention primarily during the period when the Portuguese investigation focused on the McCanns as arguidos. Advocates of this theory cited interpretations of forensic findings and perceived inconsistencies in the parents' statements. However, no physical evidence has ever confirmed this scenario, and no remains have been found to support it. Despite this, the theory persisted, largely due to its repeated circulation in media coverage. Over time, additional possibilities emerged, including the involvement of organized criminal networks, human trafficking, or individuals known to target tourist areas. These theories often relied on broader crime patterns rather than case-specific evidence. While such scenarios were not impossible, investigators were unable to establish direct links between Madeleine's disappearance and known criminal activity in the region at that time. The proliferation of theories had a cumulative effect on public understanding. Rather than clarifying the case, it often deepened confusion. Contradictory narratives competed for attention, each framed as potentially definitive. In the absence of confirmed facts, speculation filled the void, and the distinction between evidence-based reasoning and conjecture became increasingly blurred. Criticism of the investigation also intensified during this period. Analysts, former law enforcement officials, and legal experts offered retrospective evaluations of early decisions. Questions were raised about the handling of the crime scene, the timing of alerts, and the coordination between agencies. Some argued that the initial response lacked the urgency required in a suspected abduction. Others suggested that investigative resources had been misdirected or underutilized. At the same time, it became clear that hindsight played a powerful role in shaping these critiques. Decisions made under pressure, with limited information, were judged against outcomes that were unknown at the time. While some criticisms highlighted genuine procedural shortcomings, others reflected unrealistic expectations of certainty in inherently complex investigations. Despite these controversies, official interest in the case did not disappear entirely. In 2011, British authorities launched a new investigation, known as Operation Grange. This marked a significant shift, as the case was now being actively reviewed by a different law enforcement agency, operating under a separate legal framework. The stated objective was to examine all credible leads, including those that had not been fully explored during the original investigation. Operation Grange re-examined evidence, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed thousands of documents. British investigators emphasized a neutral approach, stating that they had not reached any predetermined conclusions. Their involvement renewed public interest and raised hopes that fresh perspectives and resources might succeed where earlier efforts had failed. Yet, even with renewed attention, the fundamental challenges remained. Key evidence was missing, memories had faded. Physical locations had changed, time, which can sometimes bring clarity, had in this case eroded opportunities for certainty. The continued existence of multiple theories underscored a central truth of the Madeleine McCann case. The lack of definitive answers had allowed interpretation to flourish unchecked. Each new theory said as much about collective fears and assumptions as it did about the actual events of May 3, 2007. As investigations evolved and attention shifted once more, a new figure would eventually emerge at the center of renewed suspicion, not from Portugal or the United Kingdom, but from Germany. This development would mark another turning point, reshaping the narrative yet again and reminding the world that, even after many years, the search for answers was not over. In June of 2020, more than 13 years after Madeleine McCann disappeared, German authorities made a public announcement that dramatically altered the direction of the case. Prosecutors in Germany revealed that they were investigating a German national in connection with Madeleine's disappearance and stated, for the first time, that they believed she was dead. This declaration marked a significant departure from previous official positions and immediately reignited global attention. The individual identified by German authorities was Christian Brueckner, a man with a documented criminal history, including convictions for sexual offenses against children and other violent crimes. At the time of the announcement, Brueckner was already serving a prison sentence in Germany for an unrelated rape case. His name had surfaced previously in connection with other crimes, but this was the first time he was publicly linked by prosecutors to the Madeleine McCann case. According to German investigators, Brueckner had been living intermittently in the Algarve region of Portugal around the time of Madeleine's disappearance. He reportedly resided in a camper van and worked various jobs, placing him within the geographic area during the relevant period. Authorities stated that his phone records placed him near Praia da Luz on the night Madeleine vanished, including a call received shortly before her disappearance. German prosecutors described the evidence against Brueckner as substantial but circumstantial. They did not disclose all details, citing the ongoing nature of the investigation. This lack of transparency, while legally understandable, once again created an information vacuum that was quickly filled by speculation and media interpretation. Public reaction was immediate, with many viewing this development as the most credible lead in years. British authorities confirmed that they were cooperating closely with German investigators. Operation Grange continued, now aligned with this new line of inquiry. Portuguese authorities also reopened aspects of their investigation to assist with requests for searches and evidence gathering. For the first time in many years, multiple countries appeared to be moving in coordination toward a shared suspect. Search operations resumed in Portugal. Areas near Praia da Luz, including remote locations and properties previously linked to Brueckner, were examined. Some searches involved wells, abandoned structures, and land parcels. While these efforts demonstrated renewed urgency, they did not yield publicly confirmed physical evidence directly linking Brueckner to Madeleine McCann. German prosecutors emphasized that their conclusion regarding Madeleine's death was based on a broader assessment of evidence, including patterns of behavior, digital material, and criminal history. However, they also acknowledged that no body had been found and that key elements required to bring formal charges were still missing. This distinction was critical, yet often lost in public discourse, where the announcement was interpreted by many as a definitive resolution. Brueckner denied any involvement in Madeleine's disappearance. Through legal representatives, he rejected the allegations and maintained his innocence. As with earlier phases of the case, the absence of a trial or formal charges meant that claims and counterclaims existed without judicial resolution. The emergence of a new suspect raised renewed questions about earlier investigative decisions. Observers questioned whether Brueckner could have been identified sooner and whether opportunities had been missed during the initial investigation. Others cautioned against retrospective certainty, noting that information now available may not have been accessible or actionable at the time. This phase of the case highlighted a recurring pattern. Each major development brought renewed hope, followed by continued uncertainty. While Brueckner represented the most concrete suspect to date, the legal threshold for prosecution remained unmet. The case once again stood at the intersection of belief, evidence, and limitation. As years continued to pass, the investigation remained active but unresolved. Authorities reiterated their commitment to pursuing all viable leads, while acknowledging the extraordinary challenges posed by time. For the public, the announcement served as both a reminder of progress and a confirmation of how elusive closure remained. With this development, the case entered its most recent chapter, one defined by cautious statements, guarded optimism, and the sobering recognition that even the strongest suspicions must ultimately withstand the demands of proof. The final question remained unchanged. Would the evidence ever be enough to turn belief into certainty? Following the identification of a primary suspect by German authorities, the Madeleine McCann case entered a phase defined less by dramatic revelations and more by incremental, methodical investigation. Public statements became carefully measured. Law enforcement agencies emphasized patience, legal rigor, and the need to meet evidentiary standards that could withstand scrutiny in court. This shift reflected the recognition that, after years of speculation, any misstep could undermine the possibility of a successful prosecution. Between 2020 and the years that followed, multiple searches were conducted in Portugal at the request of German investigators. These operations focused on locations believed to be connected to Christian Brueckner, including former residences, remote areas, and properties he was known to frequent. Each search was carried out under strict legal oversight, often involving collaboration between Portuguese, German, and British authorities. Despite the scale of these efforts, no publicly confirmed discovery directly linked Madeleine McCann to any of the sites examined. During this period, investigators also revisited historical evidence. Digital records, witness statements, and timelines were reanalyzed using techniques that were either unavailable or less advanced at the time of the original investigation. Advances in data analysis and forensic science offered new possibilities, but they could not compensate entirely for the loss of physical evidence or the fading reliability of human memory. German prosecutors continued to state their belief that Madeleine had died, yet they remained unable to present a complete evidentiary narrative. This cautious stance underscored the distinction between investigative confidence and legal certainty. In criminal proceedings, belief alone is insufficient. Conclusions must be supported by demonstrable, verifiable proof. Public interest persisted, though its character evolved. Coverage became more analytical and less reactive. Commentators acknowledged the complexity of pursuing justice in a case spanning multiple jurisdictions and more than a decade. At the same time, frustration grew over the lack of tangible progress. Each new search or statement raised expectations, only to be followed by silence. Operation Grange remained active, funded by the British government and tasked with supporting international efforts. Periodic reviews were conducted to assess whether continued allocation of resources was justified. Each extension of funding signaled that authorities believed unresolved questions still warranted investigation, even in the absence of immediate breakthroughs. The McCann family, while largely stepping back from public visibility, continued to mark anniversaries of Madeleine's disappearance with statements emphasizing remembrance, hope, and gratitude for ongoing efforts. Their public communications became less frequent, reflecting both the passage of time and the emotional toll of prolonged uncertainty. Legal constraints also shaped this phase. Prosecutors were limited in what they could disclose, particularly regarding evidence or strategy. This opacity, while necessary to protect the integrity of the investigation, often fueled speculation and misunderstanding. The absence of information was sometimes interpreted as inaction, even when investigative work was ongoing behind the scenes. As the case approached its second decade, it became clear that any resolution would likely come not through dramatic discovery, but through accumulation, small pieces of evidence forming a coherent picture. Whether such a picture could ever be completed remained uncertain. This stage of the investigation illustrated the enduring tension between public expectation and legal reality. The desire for closure was universal, yet the standards required to achieve it were uncompromising. The Madeleine McCann case had reached a point where persistence, rather than urgency, defined the search for truth. With the investigation ongoing and no definitive outcome in sight, attention increasingly turned to broader reflections. What does this case reveal about the nature of modern investigations? How does prolonged uncertainty affect those involved? And why, even after so many years, does this case continue to resonate so deeply? These questions lead naturally into the final reflection on the significance of the case and the lessons it leaves behind. As the investigation continued without definitive resolution, the Madeleine McCann case became defined not only by what was known, but by what remained unanswered. These unresolved elements form the core of why the case continues to provoke debate, analysis, and emotional response across the world. Even after years of inquiry, certain fundamental questions persist, resisting closure despite extensive effort. 1. Of the most central unanswered questions concerns the precise circumstances of Madeleine's disappearance. No confirmed reconstruction has ever been established. Investigators have not been able to determine with certainty whether she was taken from the apartment, left it on her own, or whether another scenario occurred entirely. Each possibility carries implications that remain unproven due to the absence of definitive physical evidence. Equally unresolved is the issue of timing. While the general window of disappearance is understood, the exact moment when Madeleine was last in the apartment remains uncertain. Minor discrepancies in witness accounts, compounded by the stress of the situation and the passage of time, have prevented investigators from narrowing this window with precision. In cases like this, even minutes can be crucial, yet here they remain elusive. The question of access also remains open. If an abduction occurred, how was it carried out without detection? The apartment's layout, combined with the presence of nearby guests and staff, raises difficult questions about visibility and opportunity. Despite extensive analysis, no consensus has emerged regarding how an offender could have entered and exited the apartment unnoticed. Another unresolved issue involves potential witnesses. Over the years, numerous sightings have been reported across different countries, often involving children resembling Madeleine. While most were eventually ruled out, each required investigation, diverting resources and attention. Whether any genuine sighting was missed or misinterpreted remains impossible to determine. The handling of the early investigation continues to invite scrutiny. Questions persist about whether evidence was lost, contaminated, or never collected. The delay in deploying certain resources, such as specialized search dogs, has been cited as a potential limitation. Yet, it is also acknowledged that investigators were operating within constraints of information, experience, and local capacity. There is also the broader question of accountability. In the absence of a resolution, responsibility remains diffuse. No individual or institution has been definitively held accountable for failures or oversights. This lack of closure extends beyond the legal system, affecting public trust and confidence in investigative processes. Perhaps most importantly, the case raises enduring questions about certainty itself. How much evidence is enough to move from suspicion to conclusion? At what point does belief become fact? And how does society reconcile the desire for answers with the reality that some cases may never be fully resolved? For the McCann family, these unanswered questions are not abstract. They represent years of uncertainty, hope, and loss. Each anniversary reinforces the absence left behind. Each new development, however small, carries emotional weight. Their experience reflects the profound human cost of unresolved disappearance. In a broader sense, the Madeleine McCann case serves as a reminder of the limits of modern investigative capability. Despite advanced technology, international cooperation, and sustained attention, some truths remain inaccessible. This reality is uncomfortable, yet essential to acknowledge. As time continues to pass, the case exists in a state of suspension, active, yet unresolved. Studied, yet uncertain, the unanswered questions remain not as failures of effort, but as reflections of complexity, chance, and the fragility of certainty. These unresolved elements lead inevitably to a final reflection: why this case continues to matter, and what it reveals about justice, memory, and the enduring impact of absence. More than 17 years after Madeleine McCann disappeared, the case remains unresolved, yet its significance has not diminished. In many ways, it has grown more profound with time. What began as the disappearance of a single child during a family holiday has evolved into a case that continues to shape discussions about justice, responsibility, and the limits of certainty. At its core, this case is a reminder of vulnerability. It illustrates how quickly ordinary life can be disrupted, and how environments perceived as safe can become the settings of irreversible loss. The circumstances surrounding Madeleine's disappearance challenged assumptions about security, parental judgment, and the protections offered by familiarity and routine. The case also exposed the pressures placed on investigative systems when faced with extraordinary public attention. Law enforcement agencies were required to operate under constant scrutiny, balancing the need for confidentiality with demands for transparency. Media coverage, while instrumental in maintaining awareness, demonstrated its power to influence perception, sometimes ahead of evidence. The tension between information and interpretation became a defining feature of the case. For the public, the enduring nature of the mystery has made Madeleine McCann a symbol. She represents not only a missing child, but the unanswered questions that persist when evidence is incomplete. Her image remains a reminder of how absence can resonate more powerfully than resolution. The case has also prompted reflection on how societies respond to uncertainty. Faced with a lack of definitive answers, people seek narratives that offer meaning or closure. In doing so, speculation can overshadow restraint, and assumption can replace verification. The Madeleine McCann case demonstrates the importance of distinguishing between what is known and what is believed. Despite years of investigation, the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Madeleine McCann has never been found. Her fate has not been established through proof, and no individual has been held legally accountable for her disappearance. This reality is difficult to accept, yet it underscores a critical aspect of justice, that conclusions must be grounded in evidence, not desire. The passage of time has not erased the human impact of this case. For those closest to Madeleine, the absence continues to define their lives. For investigators, it represents an unfinished responsibility. For the wider public, it remains a haunting reminder of how some questions endure beyond the reach of certainty. As this case continues to exist without resolution, it invites reflection rather than conclusion. It challenges us to consider how we interpret information, how we assign blame, and how we live with uncertainty. It reminds us that not every story ends with answers, and that the search for truth often requires patience as much as persistence. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann is not only a cold case. It is a lesson in restraint, humility, and the enduring weight of unanswered questions. Until definitive evidence emerges, the case remains open, not only in the files of investigators, but in the collective memory of those who continue to ask what happened on that night in Praia da Luz. And perhaps that is why, even after all these years, the case still matters.